Okay, so everyone, welcome to the first Syncross Special Ethics seminar of the term. Today we're very pleased to have Alan Buchanan. He, for those who don't know him, is a research professor at the Centre for the Philosophy of Freedom, an adjunct professor in the Department of Political Economy and Moral Science. These are both at the University of Arizona, and you can see the Arizona skies behind him now. He's also a distinguished research associate of the Uehiro Centre for Practical Ethics. He works mainly in bioethics, political philosophy, and philosophy of international law. His most recent work focuses on the question of what moral thinking can tell us about large-scale moral change. And that is the focus of his new book, Our Moral Fate, Evolution and the Escape from Tribalism. And that is very recently out with MIT Press. So you can buy that now if you want. And so today the format, just to let you know what to expect. So Alan's going to present some of the ideas in his book. Then we'll have a brief reply by Julian Savulescu, the director of the Uehiro Centre. Not too long. Alan will probably just say something briefly after that, and then we'll open it up to a general discussion. For the general discussion, the best way to do it is if you just raise your virtual hand. You've got a little, there's a little functionality there down in your options, and then I'll unmute you and you can ask your question. There's some wildlife coming past there. You can also use the chat, but it's a little difficult to manage that. So if you can, raise your hand and we'll do it that way. But if you can't, use the chat and we'll try and accommodate questions there as well. Okay, so that's enough kind of housekeeping. So now I'll hand you over to Alan, but we've got like a small technical issue, which is that I'm going to try and share my screen because of, well, you don't need to know why, but, but I'll be trying to run the slides here for Alan. All right, hold on, actually, before I do that. Nearly there. Got to start the slideshow first. Okay. Okay. So hopefully now you can see the slide.
Well, first of all, let me apologize for the image you're seeing of me. I'm outside. The sun is very bright. And I know I look like I'm in the witness protection program or something. My face is sort of blacked out, but it's the best I can do. There's workmen inside my house. It's very noisy, so I have to be outside. And I apologize. It must be sort of strange to see me blacked out like that or in profile silhouette. Well, as he was saying, I've been preoccupied in recent years with thinking about large-scale moral change and asking what evolutionary thinking can tell us about how large-scale moral change occurs. And this started out with a couple of papers in ethics, co-authored with Russell Powell, and then he and I did a book called The Evolution of Moral Progress, a Biocultural Theory. And then what I'm going to talk about today is the latest installment, that is the book, Our Moral Fate, Evolution and the Escape from Tribalism. Next slide, please. Okay, the main idea of the book is really pretty simple. It has three parts. The first is that the human moral mind is highly flexible. It can respond either tribalistically or in an inclusive fashion, depending on the environment in which the capacities of the moral mind are exercised. Second, so if we learn enough about the moral mind and the way in which different environments encourage different moral responses, then for the first time in the life of our species, we may be able to take charge of our moral fate, to shape the morality that's dominant in our society and to shape ourselves as moral agents. And I think that if we could do that, it would be one of the highest forms of creativity, and it would be the most profound exercise of autonomy, that is, taking charge of our moral fate. Next slide, please. Now, I make a lot in the book of a distinction between the moral mind and its expression in particular moralities. You might think of an analogy with the linguistic mind, okay? All normal human beings have certain capacities which enable them to learn a language, but which language they learn depends upon which environment they're in. Well, similarly, the moral mind is a set of general capacities that enable us to have the kinds of moralities that are distinctive of human beings, but how those capacities get expressed depends upon environmental inputs. Now, what do I mean by the moral mind? Well, as I said, it's the suite of cognitive and emotional traits that enable us to have distinctively human moralities, and that includes the capacity to experience moral emotions like guilt, shame, and indignation, the ability to distinguish between what someone wants and what she ought to do, the ability to internalize moral norms so that they are perceived as objective. You also need a theory of mind, the ability to make reliable inferences about mental states on the basis of behavior, the capacity to form shared or we intentions that enable joint action. Next slide, please. The capacity for extra-kin altruism, the ability to determine who is a reliable partner in cooperation, along with the ability to signal to others that one is reliable, tendency to sympathize when one witnesses suffering, or at least a tendency to react adversely to the suffering in others, a motivationally potent sense of and commitment to a moral identity, the commitment to acting so that one can convince oneself and others that one is a reliable partner, one who takes moral norms seriously. And finally, the ability to apply moral rules to new situations, including the ability to engage in moral reasoning, including consistency reasoning. Next slide, please. Now, what I try to combat at the very beginning of this book is a certain dogma, which I call the tribalistic moral nature dogma. It's the idea that humans, by virtue of their evolutionary history, are hardwired for tribalism. I'll talk more about what tribalism is, but you get the general idea. It's a kind of exclusive morality, with thick moral relationships within the group and relegation of out-group individuals to inferior status or no status whatsoever. Now, why are humans supposedly hardwired for tribalism because of their evolutionary history? Well, because the selective pressures in the environment of evolutionary adaptation, the EEA, forged moral responses that were tribalistic. The idea is that in the EEA, outgroups posed risks of biological parasites to which one's group had no immunity. And in addition, admitting strangers into our group ran the risk of social parasitism, free riding and discoordination, because presumably these strangers would not have internalized our moral norms. On the other hand, in this situation in which the moral mind was forged, supposedly, the EEA, there was a lack of institutions for peaceful cooperation among groups. So if you put together these factors, the idea is that humans would have, in that environment, developed tribalistic moralities, reacting to outgroups with fear, hostility, and preemptive aggression. Next slide, please. But there's a mistaken inference at work here. Even if it's true that human moralities in the EEA, that is the particular expressions of the moral mind in that environment, were for the most part tribalistic, it doesn't follow that the moral mind is tribalistic. Instead, there's good reason to believe that the moral mind is flexible, capable of tribalism and of more inclusive moralities depending on the environment. Well, what's the evidence? Well, as some societies moved farther away from the harsh conditions of the EEA, people in them developed more inclusive moralities. Next slide, please. Now, here's a new way to frame the question about to what extent we're tribalistic or not. When a society achieves surplus reproductive success, then morality becomes unshackled from the demands of fitness. When we achieve surplus reproductive success, it becomes affordable to extend moral regard to strangers and to non-human animals. That is, to engage in two great expansions of the circle of moral regard. Now, how does this occur? Well, it occurs through a combination of the flexibility of the moral mind with the human knack for niche construction. That is, through cumulative culture, we have built new environments in which the threat cues that evoked tribalistic responses in earlier environments have become diminished, and the benefits of inclusive moral responses have increased. So basically, the costs and benefits of either relating in a friendly way or in a hostile way to outgroup members have changed dramatically as a result of our niche construction. Okay, that's the early story about tribalism. But tribalism evolves. In earlier society, tribalist moral responses were directed against people in other societies. That's intersocietal tribalism. That's the primordial form. But in modern complex societies with persisting groups, tribalistic moral responses get directed to groups within our own society. So we have intrasocietal tribalism. Examples that I spend a lot of time on in the book are the eugenics movement of the early 20th century to mid 20th century, where a group was identified within society, people with bad genes, who were thought to be responsible for basically all social ills. And the second example is the current tribalism of right versus left in the United States. Next slide, please. Tribalism facilitates cooperation within the group, but at the expense of making cooperation with opposing groups impossible. And I'll try to explain exactly why that's so. Now, in contrast to tribalism, which is a kind of cooperation for the sake of competition with other groups, there's another way of managing competition among groups within society, namely democracy. And it appears to be a more productive form of competition among groups in society than the tribalistic mode. However, democracy may be in the process of being driven to extinction by a competing form of group competition, namely tribalism. So you can think about it being competition among groups, and then at a higher level, there's competition among modes of competition among groups. And that's subject to cultural selection pressures. Now, what's characteristic of tribalism, or you might say of extremely tribalistic ideologies? Well, they tend to present the current situation as a supreme emergency, a zero-sum, no quarter-given struggle for the highest moral stakes. They also utilize various belief immune system mechanisms, using false factual statements to resolve cognitive dissonance in a way that preserves beliefs important to our group. There's also the tendency to create echo chambers, that is, epistemic environments that are completely homogeneous, everybody believes just like you. And also tribalism tends to make association with those with different views understood to be disloyalty. Now, I want to emphasize this next item, the sorting and signaling function of tribalistic discourse. It's a matter of sorting people into us versus them, and in a way that denigrates them. And it's a way of, the discourse also functions to signal that I'm a member of this group, I'm loyal to my group. The problem is that the sorting and signaling function of tribalistic discourse drives out the discourse of truth-seeking. Now, you might miss this, you might not notice this, and if you don't notice it, you'll come to some very troubling conclusions. What appear to be interventions in dialogues about policy choices, that is, matters of substance, are really either efforts to sort people into us versus them while denigrating them, or they are signals of our group identity and our loyalty to our group. In other words, once you realize what's going on, it's not a cognitive enterprise of seeking truth, it's a matter of sorting and signaling. Then how the discourse proceeds makes a lot more sense. I mean, you see incredibly stupid remarks being made in this discourse. You see massive inconsistencies, a failure to present evidence. And so when you're looking at the tribalistic discourse of another group, they just look incredibly stupid. They look cognitively impaired. Well, that would be a good conclusion to draw if they were engaged in a cognitive enterprise of seeking truth, but they're not. They're doing something entirely different. They're sorting and signaling. Next slide, please. So if you think tribal discourse is about what it appears on the surface to be about, social and political issues, you'll have to conclude that those engaged in it have profound cognitive disabilities. They make illogical inferences, accept bogus evidence as conclusive. They aren't critical about our beliefs. They accept and echo testimony that lacks credibility. But that's missing the point. They aren't reasoning badly. They aren't reasoning at all. They're engaged in sorting and signaling. Next slide, please. So here's some more characteristics of tribalism as I understand it. There's a tendency to clump people together, in effect espousing a kind of folk essentialist ontology of the other. They are all alike. They share a common essence that rigidly determines their behavior. And by the way, Lawrence Hirschfeld has a book in which he documents this kind of essentialist ontology aspect of tribalism. And here's the kicker. It's not just that they're all the same, they're all either incorrigibly stupid or uninformed or irredeemably insincere and malicious. Example of this, I don't know if you get much of this in the UK, but in the United States, conservatives use the term libtard to refer to liberals. That is, it's a contraction for liberal retarded person, not just using a sort of politically incorrect term of retardation rather than developmental disability, but saying that liberals generally are stupid, they're cognitively impaired. As an example of the other way of viewing the out-group, namely that they're hopelessly corrupt and insincere, think about a kind of ritual that Rush Limbaugh repeats over and over again. He says that liberals in the United States don't really care about the welfare of immigrants. They're only concerned to have open borders because they think immigrants will vote Democratic. Well, you can see what's going on in the second case, right? You can, as with the first case, the libtard label, if you respond in this way to somebody, then you totally dismiss the content of what they're saying. You needn't look at the content. You needn't engage with them because they're either incorrigibly stupid and misinformed, or they're irredeemably corrupt and insincere. In either way, it's a way of dismissing the whole truth-seeking discourse by attaching labels, by sorting people in a certain way. In either case, there's no point in trying to reason with them. They are unreasonable. They're literally incapable of reasoning. And because they're all alike, there's no point in seeking out diversity of views among them and working toward compromise or meeting in the middle. Next slide, please. There's also the clumping together of issues and values, because all of them, those other bad people, are alike. They have a shared essence. They all think alike, value the same things, and consequently they can coordinate on a grand plan, the fulfillment of which will be a complete catastrophe for us. So we're in a situation where we either have to pick their bundle or ours. There's no mixing and matching. If we compromise on one item, we lose everything. Next slide, please. So here's what tribalism, characterized in that way, rules out. It rules out bargaining, because bargaining assumes relations are not zero-sum, whereas tribalism presents conflicts as zero-sum. Now, this is a huge regression. Bargaining, that is, exchange for mutual advantage, is a milestone in the evolution of human cooperation. It allows cooperation among strangers, people with different values and religions, etc. So proceeding in a way that wipes out the possibility of bargaining is a huge regression in terms of human cooperation. Secondly, tribalism rules out compromise, because compromise means giving away on one issue to get what you want on another. The unfissionable bundle framing rules this out. Now, because bargaining and compromise are essential for democracy to work, tribalism, by ruling out bargaining and compromise, undercuts democracy. Next slide, please. But that's not the worst. Tribalism hollows out one of the most important achievements of moral progress. Progress in how we think about morality, the transition from morality understood as a set of authoritative commands not to be questioned, along with the assumption that our group is in exclusive possession of the moral truth, transition from that understanding of morality to quite a different one, where morality is seen as centrally involving the giving and taking of reasons among equals. beings who hold each other accountable through a practice of reason giving about how we ought to live. Next slide, please. In other words, tribalism is incompatible with what Darwin calls the second person perspective, because it relegates members of opposing groups to the status of beings that can't be reasoned with. And so far as the ability to reason is part of what makes us human, this means denying full human status to the other. This is a regression from what I referred to earlier as the first great expansion, the recognition that all persons have an equal basic moral status, a status that requires that we justify our actions toward them, that we reason together as equals. Now, what this means is that it's a mistake to use the term tribalism and polarization as if they were synonyms. People often do this. I think polarization is not nearly as serious a problem as tribalism. Polarization means there's a growing disagreement on substantive matters, policies, for example. But that's quite compatible with respecting those you disagree with and proceeding on the assumption that they can be reasoned with, that bargains are possible, that compromises are possible. Tribalism rules all that out. It's not just a matter of disagreements on matters of policy. It's a matter of how you regard the other and whether you relegate them to a status of being not reason able. Next slide, please. Now, how can we overcome this new form of intra-societal tribalism? Well, the short answer is I don't know. The problem is that tribalism is ending tribalism is a collective good subject to elective action problems, free rider and assurance problems. That's because tribalism has a formidable stability. If the tribalistic mode is in operation, then for any one party unilaterally to defect from the tribalistic discourse to try to return to the truth-seeking discourse puts them at a severe disadvantage. So even if everybody agrees we're better off if we weren't playing the tribalistic game, it may be hard to end it. Now, I think that the reason we have this new kind of tribalism, intra-societal tribalism, has to do with institutional changes in the institutional environment. And consequently, I think that it's going to take institutional changes to try to reduce the sway of tribalism. Here are some possibilities. And they're all designed to try to bridge gaps, to force people to try to listen to each other and bargain and compromise. For example, there might be greater use of supermajority voting rules. That tends to encourage cooperation. There might be a switch in the US to proportional representation and to having more than, should say, two parties. In the United States, you're really forced to choose between two equally obnoxious bundles of policies making up the platforms of the two parties. Now, in the book, I go in some more detail into what these institutional changes may be, but I want to emphasize that I think institutional changes are needed because I don't think it's realistic just to say to people, well, pull up your moral socks, quit acting tribalistically, quit sorting and signaling and return to a truth-seeking discourse. I don't think it's going to happen because it's kind of like an arms race. Once the other side is acting in a tribalistic way, it's very hard for you not to. Next slide, please. Now, something that I didn't emphasize a lot in the presentation, but I come down heavily in the book on, is that to understand why we react tribalistically, you need to understand what the threat cues were in the environment of evolutionary adaptation that tended to encourage the moral mind to be expressed in tribalistic moralities. And those threat cues are very powerful for us, and they're used by demagogues all the time. And one of the most powerful threat cues is, the threat of disease. And that's why whenever you see xenophobia, whenever you see negative attitudes toward migrants, you'll see certain metaphors being used. You'll see people like Trump describing immigrants as an infestation. And this provokes a primordial fear of biological parasites. There's also the idea that immigrants are social parasites, or as the Germans use the term, useless eaters. And there are vast exaggerations of what's at stake in current conflicts. For example, the title of Sean Hannity's latest book is Live Free or Die, America on the Brink. Okay? This is supreme emergency thinking. And if you get people into that way of thinking, then they're willing to suspend almost all of the ordinary moral rules for the sake of avoiding an enormous catastrophe. Next slide, please. Now, here's one suggestion. As we learn more about which words and images evoke tribalistic responses, things like infestation, that sort of thing, we may need to revise our ideas about the limits of free speech. Such an effort would be much more precise and targeted than the vague notion of hate speech. In other words, if we learn enough about the moral mind and about the threat cues that provoke destructive tribalistic responses from the moral mind, then we might be able to do a better job of trying to restrain people who use those threat cues to whip people up into very destructive tribalistic behavior. Now, that probably doesn't sound too radical if you're in the UK. In the United States, it's heresy because there's a kind of fetishism of free speech and the idea that there are basically no legitimate restrictions on free speech. I find this totally baffling. Okay, here's a conjecture. Intrasocietal tribalism is both undermining democracy and fueled by the perception that democracy isn't working. The latter prediction, that democracy isn't working, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy if people become tribalistic. So I think there's a kind of a deadly interaction between the perception of the decline of democracy and enthusiasm for the tribalistic mode. Next slide, please. Conclusion. An effective response to tribalism must be largely institutional. We need to use our powers of niche construction, informed by better knowledge of how the moral mind reacts in different environments, to develop what I like to call a science of moral institutional design, designing institutions not just with an eye to efficiency or even to justice, but also so as to create conditions under which the best potential of the moral mind can be realized. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Excellent. Now, Julian, are you going to, if you're...
Well, I mean, let me just ask for a bit of clarification or a bit of development, because it's a fascinating talk, Alan. But first, I mean, just to start with a cheeky question before I ask you the more serious ones, let's just imagine for a moment I was a Republican listening to this talk, which I'm not. And I replied, well, your critique of tribalism is actually a shining example of tribalism, because you describe beings that can't be reasoned with. You know, and the examples you've given are, you know, this Sean Hannity, I don't even know who he is, or the person who says that Democrats are admitting immigrants to vote for them. You're saying these people are people that can't be reasoned with. So how do you think, you know, you could find some common ground with the people that you're including as the sort of exponents of tribalism? That's just a sort of cheeky question.
Let me respond to the cheeky one first, because I think it's a great question. May I do that just very briefly?
Sure.
We go to the next one. Okay. Look, my claim is that the tribalistic mentality presents people on the other side as being not reasonable. But that doesn't mean that they aren't reasonable, okay? It's just that they're not engaged in reasoning when they're engaging in tribal discourse. They're engaged in sorting and signaling. So the problem is, how do you get people out of that mode into the reason-giving mode? That's the problem. But I'm not making the mistake of saying people on the other side are unreasonable. What I'm saying is that tribalistic discourse presents them that way and erects enormous obstacles to cooperation by doing that, okay? But the question is, how do you get people to shift from the signaling and sorting mode to the truth-seeking mode? And I think the answer has to be, at least in part, institutional, but it's very difficult to think about this, because you already have in place a lot of the things you think you would need, right? In a liberal society, you have freedom of expression and freedom of association. But nonetheless, those very freedoms seem to promote this kind of behavior. That's what's really frightening about it. Okay, and the question is, how do you change that? And how do you change it in a way that's consistent with your liberal principles? Right, that's even harder.
Okay, so that brings me to my second main question, which is, your thesis is we have both tribalistic tendencies and tendencies to more inclusive morality within our moral minds. But at the moment, as you correctly diagnose, we're in the midst of a sort of tribal war in many parts of the world. So we don't seem to be doing very well. But there in the future is this more inclusive world and group of people. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how we get from here to there, and what restrictions of freedom might be necessary. So I'd like you to sort of also just comment on the role of democracy within this context. Because if you look at the pandemic, the countries that have done well, Singapore, Taiwan, Vietnam, these are not flourishing democracies. In fact, Singapore is a benign dictatorship. I just heard a talk on how they managed to deal so well with the pandemic. But democracy, as you just alluded to, seems to be contributing to the problem. So I wonder whether you could talk about what restrictions or modifications of democracy might be necessary, and what these other institutional reforms would be that are going to take us from here, which is chaos, to this sort of utopia of inclusion.
Oh, gee, why didn't you ask me a hard question, Julian? That's a big one. Look, I think overall there has been progress in the last 300 years toward inclusion. More people recognize that some non-human animals at least have moral standing. More people are committed to the idea that all persons have some equal status, often cashed out these days in terms of human rights. But there's no such thing as lockstep progress, and there's no guarantee that there won't be regression. I think we're in a period of terrific regression right now, much more morally regressive than a lot of people realize. It's not just that democracy is being undermined, it's the whole second person perspective, whole progressive conception of morality that's being undermined. And by the way, I think it's really important not to think of tribalism as a kind of immorality, although it produces immoral results. What makes it really potent, motivationally potent, is that it's moralized. That is, the sorting of the world into us versus them, it's done in moral terms, and it taps into moral motivation. That's what makes it so extremely powerful. Now, what's the key to making a transition out of this regressive phase to a more progressive phase? Well, I think you have to look at what's happened in the past. That's why I've studied large-scale moral change in the past. And in the book, I list over a dozen environmental factors that all have to be in place at the same time in the same place for there to be a reliable shift toward more inclusive moralities. And I think it's very rare that you get the confluence of all of these environmental conditions together at the same time in the same place. And there are many countries where there's not much hope that those conditions will be satisfied ever, or at least for the foreseeable future. So I think there's no call for being optimistic that we're marching toward greater inclusiveness. I'm actually extremely worried that democracies are not, or partial democracies, are not capable of fending off the tribalistic move. And then the question is, well, what's the solution? And I'm not confident that a democratic solution that satisfies all sorts of liberal principles about non-coercion would work. It may be that we have to bottom out. It may be that the tribalism has to make it completely apparent to almost everyone that things are not working before there's a radical kind of restructuring. But whether the radical restructuring could be done consistent with democratic and liberal principles, I simply don't know.
We should allow other people to ask Alan questions, but absolutely fascinating, Alan. Thank you. One of the most important books of our time. Go and buy it, everyone. I have my own copy here.
Oh, show them the cover. This is one of my favorite photographs ever. Okay, now you can't see it. There's a huge sea of people like robots, all giving the Nazi salute, and there's one guy right in the middle with his arms folded, with a very skeptical look on his face, and he might be thinking something like bullshit. Okay, we know who this guy was. His name is August Landemesser. This is 1937. So I have a T-shirt with that, and that's one of my favorite images. And it's like, don't be a herd animal. Don't be tribalistic. Think for yourself.
Okay, great. Now let's so we can open up to the attendees now. So if you're you can raise your virtual hand there. I see Roger Crisp has his hand raised. So first allow you to talk. Roger, can you ask your question?
Thanks very much, Doug and Alan. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hi Roger, good to see you. Whoops, I lost your audio.
Doug, there's also one in the Q&A.
Yeah,
Okay.
good. Something seems to be going wrong with your audio there, Roger. I don't know what's happened there. We'll come back to you. Maybe we can sort that out. We've got Stephen Rainey has a question. Stephen, have we got you there?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks for the talk. That was really interesting. And I liked how you started with some reference to the ways in which language develops. And I wondered if you thought there might be something more that could be said on that level in terms of the ethics as it pertains to communicative language, especially since the communication breakdowns seem to be at the heart of the issue here in many ways, like in terms of truth seeking versus signaling and sorting. So for example, one example might be in terms of, as you mentioned, freedom of speech, not as being something like being entitled to say what you want, but instead recast as you're entitled to say what your reasons can support. And that's a kind of a rational approach, if you like, to trying to recast that sort of question in terms of the language itself. Although the problem being there's no obvious way to strike nonsense from the record once it's out there. But I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, staying at the linguistic level as a guide for action here.
Yeah, look, I think this is really important, and I do quite a bit of it in the book, but I want to do more. And I actually like to work with a linguist to try to study some of these patterns of tribalistic discourse. But you're absolutely right. I mean, from one perspective, what we're seeing is a complete violation of the most basic principles of communicative ethics, right? I mean, not listening to what the other person says, not giving them a presumption of rationality, not being willing to bear the burden of providing evidence for what you say. I mean, the violations of the most basic principles of communicative ethics are rife within the whole tribalistic discourse. And what I find frightening is that people don't seem to be aware of how serious this is. That is, they don't seem to realize that they're contributing to, the destruction of the kind of discourse that's needed for grappling with real issues. So I've always found it puzzling that both in ordinary life and in moral philosophy, people don't pay nearly enough attention to the ethics of believing and to the ethics of discourse.
Great. Yeah, thanks. I see there's a question in the chat. I'm just going to go back to Roger now because I think he looks like he might have solved his problem. Roger, oh, hold on. Maybe, yeah, sorry.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Oh, terrific. Sorry about that. I'm actually listening to you, Alan, on two devices, and they kind of started talking to each other. I now see that was a mistake. Yeah, thanks very much for a terrific talk, and I'm looking forward to the book. Your claims many of them were quite general, but quite a few of the examples were to do with America.
Yeah.
And it does seem to me that it's particularly important at the moment what happens in America. So I've got a couple of questions. One is, do you think America is going to survive? And the second question is to do with institutional reform and particularly the Constitution. So yes. I read something recently by Norman Ornstein, I think it was, who said that if things go in the same sort of way over the next 10 years, then you'll have, I think, 30% of people electing 70% of the senators. So it looks like a need for reform.
Yes.
What kind of reforms do you think might be possible?
Roger, this is a great question. I mean, look, if people are indulging in tribalism because they're disillusioned with democracy, then one obvious response would be to try to make democracy better. And in the United States, that's the long list of things would have to be done. I mean, we have gerrymandering of districts, we have voter suppression, we have the unrestrained influence of money on the political process in a country where the Supreme Court has claimed that political donations by corporations are an exercise of free speech, a legitimate exercise of free speech. I think we're very far from having a democracy in the United States, and it's getting worse. And the problem is that a lot of people don't distinguish between whether democracy is flawed or whether we've got a very flawed democracy. And I think that there would have to be fundamental change. And the problem is there's not going to be fundamental change as long as we're deadlocked in the tribalistic mode. I think that in some ways the United States has become like a sort of an uncharitable scripture of the Middle East. It's just a matter of power, of staying in power or getting power, and viewing every little disagreement as Armageddon, and that, you know, no quarter can be given. We've got to thwart every initiative of the other side. And when this happens, the idea of the common interest is completely lost. There is no common interest. I don't think the United States has the unity right now to be a democracy, or even a nation for that matter. In fact, there are some people now talking about splitting the country up so that you would have states that are red states and states that are blue states, and they would be sovereign countries, because that's just an admission that we can't get along, that we have no common interest, no common identity.
Right, good. Okay, so now I've got a question in the chat, which is asking, what do you mean by surplus reproductive success?
Good, good. What I mean is that our species, at least large numbers of our species, have gotten to the point where they've succeeded so well in putting food on the table, getting shelter, providing security, that their behavior is no longer tightly controlled by the demands of reproductive fitness. In other words, they're in a zone where we're still subject to evolutionary pressures, but there's a wider range of behavior that we can engage in that's not too costly in reproductive terms. It's either fitness neutral, or even if it decreases fitness, we've got such a surplus that it doesn't put us in danger. So now we can afford to act in ways that we couldn't afford to act in harsher environments. So I like to think of it as morality as evolving originally among humans to solve problems of cooperation, and it did so very well and increased our success enormously. But until we developed much more abundant environments and much more peaceful environments, for the most part, are limited by the requirements of reproductive fitness. Now, morality is unshackled from that. Now, we can't act in ways that result in mass extinction of us, okay? But we have a much wider range of possible behaviors we can engage in, of possible moralities we can adopt, than we did when we were tightly controlled by the demands of reproductive fitness. I hope that helps.
Okay, good. So now I've got a question from the person who asked that question said thank you, so it does help, I think. We've got I'm going to butcher this name. Sorry, we've got Joao Fabiano.
So, except for the last century, nutrition, health, and lifespan have been worse than at the EEA. So that doesn't seem to fit with your claim that we became less tribalistic because of increased security, and in particular, infectious diseases. That's the example you bring up a lot, have almost entirely been brought by agriculture.
I'm not completely sure I understood you, but I think you were saying that in the 20th century, we've had more violence and insecurity.
I mean, except for the 20th century, the sort of environmental security has not been necessarily higher, at least in respect to health and infectious diseases. So the lifespan has been shorter, and most of the infectious diseases that we know of have been brought by agriculture.
I understand you now. I understand it. Yeah. There's a wonderful book on this called Against the Grain. Yeah, it looks like that in the transition from foraging or hunting gathering to agrarian society, that most people for a very long period of time, many centuries, were actually worse off. Their diets weren't as rich. The stature was shorter, which is an indication of inferior nutrition. And you're right, most of the infectious diseases that have been big killers in human history have come from our association with food animals in agrarian societies. All of that's true. And yet, in the last 300 years or so, in some societies, there's been a tremendous reduction of infectious diseases, beginning in the early 20th century with vaccination for childhood diseases and with better public health measures. And even during the periods of the world wars, the homicide rate among males of the combatant countries has been in the range of 3 to 4%, whereas among foragers, there's evidence that homicide rates among males were more in the 25 to 35% range. So I think, again, you don't want to say that all good things go together and there's been progress overall. I'm not confident to make sort of global, all things considered progress judgments, but I think that there has been really significant progress with respect to the two great expansions in the last 300 years or so. And that one way to look at this is that many people are now buffered against the harsher selective pressures that were predominant in the EEA. And because they are buffered, they can engage in a lot of behavior toward others that previously would have been too costly. So the opportunity is there. And then the question is, are there sufficient changes in people's moral identity that they feel motivated to take advantage of those opportunities for behaving in a more inclusive way? And I spend a lot of time in the book trying to figure out exactly what that motivation is.
Thank you.
Okay, good, thanks. All right, so now we have Roger Trigg.
Yes, you've placed a lot of emphasis on institutional change. I'm wondering what emphasis you place on personal moral character, even things like respect for truth and personal integrity. And I ask that because I think that if institutional change is driven by people who are corrupt, we're still in big trouble. Yes, excellent point. Look, I don't want to downplay the importance of character, of the epistemic virtues, and truth-seeking and honesty and willingness to consider objections to your own view. These are incredibly important. It's just that I think that those norms have been switched off, as it were, in the tribalistic sphere. That people simply are engaged in a different activity. They're not engaged in a cognitive, truth-seeking activity, and consequently, it's not surprising that they don't apply the norms to their behavior that they would if they were engaged in a truth-seeking behavior. So the question is, how can you get people to abandon the tribalistic
discourse, get back to the truth-seeking discourse, and then take seriously the norms of intellectual virtue, of proper belief formation that should govern a truth-seeking enterprise. And by the way, one of the things that contributes to this not happening is the tendency of talk radio political figures to blend entertainment with something like journalism. And I think this gives them license, because they say, well, I'm really partly an entertainer. Rush Limbaugh says that, for example. It gives them license to go even further in abandoning any of the ethical principles of communication.
Thank you.
Good. Now we have Ben Davies. Ben, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Great, thank you for a really fascinating talk. I mean, it's actually kind of related to the previous question, really, but I suppose my thought is that given part of the solution you've suggested is these kind of big institutional and maybe even constitutional changes, even if we have people of good character trying to do that, isn't there going to be a kind of basic problem getting started, which is that it's going to have to be one side or the other who gets going. And
Yep.
Given the tribalism we see, the other side is going to almost inevitably interpret that, you know, something like restrictions on free speech in a cynical way. And so how,
Yes.
I mean, is there a way to avoid that kind of paradox at the start?
I don't know. You know, sometimes in my cheerier moments, I think that if, say, the Democratic Party all of a sudden just acknowledged how bad things were in tribalistic discourse and that they were contributing to it as well, and then sort of took a public pledge to not respond tribalistically to tribalistic moves on the part of the other side, it's just possible that if people are disgusted enough with the tribalism they see all around them, that taking the high ground like that might be advantageous. But I really don't know. On the other hand, it might just be that it plays into the hands of the other side, and it amounts to sort of unilateral disarmament in an arms race.
Thank you.
Okay, now we have Trevor Davis. Are you Trevor?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Hello, Alan. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And it picked up a lot of the themes that I've looked at in Western democracies myself. But I'd like to take you for a moment, if I could, on a question to a broader historic and perhaps a global landscape. And maybe it touches on one of the earlier questions as well. It's arguable, I suppose, that over the last tens of millennia, the protection and advancement of the tribe has been one of the main pillars of human society. And it's been a force for good as well as for ill.
Yes.
And I guess it would be wrong to think that that dynamic has stopped in 2020 in a world where many of the societies around us still exhibit tribal structures within their own societies. So the question is, to what extent do you think that your analysis of the challenges facing US and Western democracies is equally valid in the context of those other nations? And are you characterizing tribalism as universally bad? And if not, how do you extend the dialogue to those nations in a way that they would accept and understand?
Yeah, look, this is a fantastic question. First of all, I mean, there's one way of understanding tribalism that just means something like partiality toward one's own group, right? And I don't think there's anything wrong with that per se. And I think you're right that a lot of good is done by people being motivated in part by feelings of partiality toward their own group. They're willing to make sacrifices. They're willing to bear costs to advance the collective projects of their group. I think that human beings are by nature groupish beings, and that probably they're always going to make distinctions between us and them, and they're generally going to be somewhat derogatory toward them. But I don't think that's the same as the sort of extremely divisive zero-sum mentality that I've been talking about. So yeah, I mean, I think that some degree of partiality towards one's own group is not only permissible, but probably obligatory in some context. And the question is, how do you prevent the sort of natural tendency toward sorting ourselves into groups from becoming this kind of full-blown, extremely destructive tribalism. That seems to me to be the key issue.
Indeed, I mean, that's to the heart of my question. How do you do that?
How do you do it? Yeah. You mean, how do you strike the right balance between?
Well, I mean, yeah. How do you? I mean, if you're writing to nations and societies other than one's own, how do you articulate the issue in a way that they don't feel it is an attack on their what they might be perceive at the simplest level, one of family values?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I think the thing to do is to say, you know, tribalism is everybody's problem. It's not a Western problem. It's not an Asian problem, and that we're all equally vulnerable and equally responsible for dealing with the problem. But I think, let me give you a concrete example where this has come up recently, okay? So-called vaccine nationalism, right? I don't know if any of you saw this article in Science that I was one of many co-authors on rationing COVID-19 vaccine among countries. And right there, you see the conflict between national partiality and cosmopolitan values. Right? I mean, there's some people who just say, look, if we can get hold of a lot of vaccine, we'll just use it for ourselves. Remember, Trump tried to buy all of the product of a German pharmaceutical company developing a vaccine to try to make a contract to get all of it to be used in the United States. The company turned it down. So yeah, I mean, there's a constant struggle to define the limits of proper partiality, but you can have partiality without having these tremendous barriers to communication and mutual respect that are part of the tribalistic mentality and discourse.
Thank you.
Okay, so here's a question in the question and answer section, kind of on a similar theme to what we've been pursuing a bit. They ask, how can we push for institutional change when forces that rely on tribalism for votes and legitimacy are in power? How do you make inclusiveness something that people would care about while voting?
Yeah, I guess, you know, here I'm sort of banking on the bottoming out strategy. That is that eventually, if enough people see how destructive, how unproductive the tribalistic mode is, that they may be motivated to make some changes in the direction of inclusion. But, you know, things may have to get extremely bad before that happens. And if they do get extremely bad, that's not the only possible outcome. Instead, it might be that there's even more of a tendency toward tribalism, more of a tendency toward authoritarian leaders who are thought to be able to solve problems that democracy can't solve. So yeah, I mean, I wish I had a more positive, constructive message, but I don't at this point.
And got another one here. In your research and thinking for the book, did you come across any psychological research or models which you felt were potentially useful in thinking about tribalism, for example, either as a cultural phenomenon or as individual differences in proneness to tribalism?
You know, there is some psychological literature that identifies sort of 5 basic personality traits and then sorts people into which of those traits tend to be most salient in their thinking and behavior. And it looks like from that literature that some people are much more vulnerable to tribalism than other people are. For example, there's some evidence that in the United States, people who identify themselves as being conservatives tend to be less willing to listen to opposing political views and tend to view the current situation as what I referred to earlier as a supreme emergency, and to do so more so than people who don't self-ascribe as being on the right. So yeah, it looks like, you know, there are normal cognitive biases and errors that apply to everybody, but then there's the filter of individual personalities, and this is going to make a difference as to how recruitable somebody is for the tribalistic endeavor. And if we learned more about this, we might learn some things that are relevant to trying to mitigate the problem. You know, there's also some research that there are actually genotypic differences between conservatives and progressives, or whatever, liberals, whatever you want to call them. I'm a little skeptical of that, but I haven't examined it carefully enough to know whether my skepticism is fully warranted.
Okay, good, thanks. We're out of the questions, and if someone else wants a question, here we go. Kate Fox, you're up. You're muted at the moment. Oh, hold on, did I do that?
Oh, I'd like to just add one thing if we got a second. Look, I'm aware that the presentation that I gave today looked probably pretty cartoonish and oversimplified and full of holes, but that's because I was trying to give an overview of the whole book. I really think it's a good book, and I think that the detailed descriptions of all of the environmental factors that apparently needed to come together to get some of these morally progressive shifts we've seen in the last 300 years, I think that's valuable. And also there's a theory in the book, a theory of moral pioneers. That is, it looks like in many of these progressive movements, it's not a all at once sort of majority thing. It's that there are some leaders, some moral pioneers. And given that they may be facing a lot of cost for advocating what they're advocating, social and material costs, the question arises, well, what motivates them to do that? And I have a theory about how it's largely the particular social position of certain people that means that the cost of their going against the status quo are lower. And I document this by looking at the profiles of British abolitionists and American abolitionists, and at the strategies they use to reduce the cost of stepping out front and criticizing the status quo. And I think that the theory of sort of moral pioneers is an important element of a theory of large-scale moral change, and I hope to have contributed to that somewhat.
Good. Kate, are you there now?
Yes, I am. I have two questions. One is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, as I understand it, both from your book with Russell Powell, The Evolution of Moral Progress, and in your current book, you're using phenotypic plasticity, you know, the example of the water flea. So you're talking about conditions under which a creature may develop defenses, like the water flea's spiky helmet and the tail and so on, but also presumably, and as I understand it from your book, you're not buying into the argument that the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, or the varieties of them, were the sort of group level Hobbesian war of all against all, which seems to be contradicted by the evidence. So therefore you are assuming that there were the benign conditions as well as the threatening conditions. And you're talking about ancestral cues of threat, the threatening conditions.
Right.
What are your views on the benign conditions and the ancestral cues as to the benign conditions that we might or might not experience?
Oh, wonderful question. I wish I'd thought of that. Look, you're right. I mean, I have this kind of revisionist history of the EEA. That is, I don't think there's good reason to believe that it was uniformly harsh and hostile toward any form of cooperation with other groups, because we know from studies of forager groups that persisted long enough for modern anthropologists to study them, that in fact they do have some relations with other groups through long distance trade, for example, of projectile points, that's one thing, or ochre, and also outmarrying practices. Military alliances may have come later in the Mesolithic rather than in
Exactly.
the scene. That may be true, but it looks like, you know, even environmental differences. I mean, look, if one of the big problems about reacting in a cooperative way with strangers is the threat of parasites, well, in colder, drier climates, that's less of a threat. And so the question is, how did people learn to recognize that the other was potentially a good partner rather than a threat? And it looks to me as if there were opportunities for mutual benefit, then there would have been selective pressures for learning how to discern when to turn away from a stranger and when to turn toward the stranger. So I'm just a little leery about the idea that there was one EEA, that it was uniformly this war of each group against all, because that's not what you see with foragers.
I agree with you on that. Yeah.
But as to what the cues are, you know, I mean, I'm sure there are psychological studies that have been done on trust, right? About what kind of signals reliably generate trust in the other party, and you know, who's good at detecting those signals, what to do if the signals are faked, if they're false signals. I mean, this is bound, you know, the sort of benefit opportunity cues, you know, are just as important as threat cues. And it would be good to know a lot more about that if you're trying to arrange environments in which people will have inclusive responses rather than exclusive tribalistic ones. That's a wonderful line of research to think about.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Kate. Okay, I've got another question on the Q&A. What is your best defense against the objection that your proposal radically overestimates humankind's capacity for and willingness to practice both rationality and morality?
Yeah, I think we're, the morality part is not hard. I think we're deeply moral beings, and that most people's commitment to their moral identity is very robust. So it's not that. But the question is, how can you get people to abandon the sorting and signaling mode of discourse and get back to some truth seeking? And are you banking too much on people's rationality? Well, in one sense, no. I mean, I'm against the idea of just saying to people, look, here's the problem, you know, don't continue to act tribalistically, get back to the truth-seeking discourse. I don't think that is going to work. And so in that sense, I'm not rationalistic. I don't think just giving people good reasons is going to be adequate. And that's why I've emphasized that you need more of an environmental change. I mean, there's got to be some input from character, but I think if to bank too much on that is to be too rationalistic. You need to think about what the institutional arrangement is and what incentives the institutional arrangement provides for cooperation, for listening to people, for respecting to the other side, and for seeking compromises and bargains. Because you've got to provide incentives for people to do that. And I've just begun to think about this. And like I said in the book, I list a few political innovations, institutional innovations that might help. But I think it's going to take massive re-engineering. And then the question is, you know, if we're so sunk in tribalism, who's going to be willing to come together and agree on what measures we ought to take to try to get out of it? I don't know. And that's why I said I'm not sure that a democratic solution is going to work.
Thanks, Alan. Does anyone else have any questions? You want to raise your hand? Julian, do you want to jump back in with a question?
Well, I was interested in your view on the role of technology, particularly artificial intelligence, the internet and social media in contributing to tribalism, and big tech and capitalism. I saw an interesting documentary on Netflix called The Social Dilemma, which gives a very convincing argument that it's a large part of the tribalistic polarization we see in society is a product of the capturing of attention and the practices of big tech. So I'm wondering what your views are on that.
Yeah, look, I think that one of the reasons that tribalism has taken root and become so pervasive is because of the opportunities provided by electronic media. I think it makes it so much easier for people to sort themselves into groups and to inhabit echo chambers where they don't hear any dissenting views at all. And now they can signal their identity and loyalty to a group very cheaply through using electronic media by habituating certain sites, making comments in reply to things other people say. And I don't think at this point there's anything in the technology that's pointing us in the direction of observing the ethical principles of communication. Now, it might just be that it's too early, that there's an cultural evolutionary process, and that people are going to develop better epistemic norms for how they use the internet. It may be that, it's just too early for this to have happened yet, but I'm not convinced of that, because I'm not convinced that whatever cultural selective pressures there are for developing more responsible epistemic norms are nearly as strong as the attractions of tribalism.
Thanks, Alan. I was wondering if let's imagine that we take the right steps and we go back into a mode where we're reason giving with each other, and we kind of have the Democrats and Republicans are talking to each other. But then, even as we're giving reasons, we find that we're kind of irreconcilable in our positions. And one way that might come up is that one side sees the concern with collective action problems and thinks, right, we need to give up some individual freedoms to try and solve these problems, and one of those being the tribalism problem you talk about, but obviously there's many others. And then the other side says, no, I value individualism so highly that I'm going to push on with that, despite all the evidence showing that such a highly individualistic approach undermines the potential for collective action solutions.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think you're describing the United States, and I said that in a sense tribalism is worse than polarization, but I think that each contributes to the other, and that in the United States now there's just some fundamental cleavages among the population, and I don't see that they're going to be resolved by any sort of rational discourse. And one of them is exactly what you said. There's some people on the right in this country who have an extreme version of individual liberty. It means they shouldn't have to wear a mask in public. They shouldn't get vaccinated. They shouldn't have to get vaccinated. And then there are other people who have a quite different view and realize that you may need to use the coercive power of the state to solve collective action problems, and that this, of course, will involve limiting individual liberty, but that's perfectly okay given what's at stake. I mean, these differences are so profound, and differences about what the proper role of government is in the United States, and what the default attitude toward government is, whether it should be viewed with extreme suspicion or given a presumption of beneficence. These are just radically different views, and I don't see how they're going to change. I mean, I think tribalism makes it all worse. It makes it even more difficult to deal with the problems, but the problems are severe enough as it is. I mean, again, I don't think there is a United States anymore. I don't think there's the kind of unity that you associate with a well-functioning political entity.
Right. Thanks, although that was depressing. Maybe sorry I asked that question. So we have, I've got one more here in the Q&A. We've got Sebastian Gardner asks, in your research of tribalism, I'm sure issues concerning evolutionary psychology have been a centerpiece. Have you discovered any compelling resistance to evolutionary psychology?
Well, I mean, there are just some people that, that in the social sciences who are worried about reduction of their discipline to something that they view as alien, evolutionary psychology. Among philosophers, I think there is the sort of move toward naturalism in philosophy, and a lot of younger philosophers especially are enthusiastic about engaging with evolutionary thinking, evolutionary psychology in particular. But I'm a little worried because most of us are not very well trained to be judicious consumers of empirical research. And so we may not be looking at the right things. And also, I think there's a very strong tendency toward cherry picking, that is, confirmation bias. You sort of look for empirical studies that support what you already thought was the right view, and you don't look at the other side. So I think we're in a period where there's promise of good things to come if people take facts and scientific reasoning from other disciplines seriously when they do philosophy, but it's fraught with a lot of risk. And we've already seen this. I mean, we've seen cases where results have been vastly overinterpreted to the point of falsehood. So I'm ambivalent about this, in other words. But I have a lot to learn from the social sciences and from evolutionary psychology.
Okay, we have Becky Brown. You have a question? You there, Becky? You're still, I think that.
Yep, I'm here, thanks. Yeah, thanks very much, Alan. I thought some of the things you were saying sounded quite close to the kinds of things that Dan Kahan discusses in the context of identity protected reasoning. And the impression I got from that work was that there were some more moderate kinds of interventions you could use in order to encourage people to attend to evidence that maybe didn't fit with their in-group so well. So having kind of respected and prominent members of the Republican Party advocating for policies which are aimed to kind of combat climate change, for instance, like having people, or I think there's I don't know much about this, but I think there's like a Tea Party Republican who is a big kind of campaigner for paying proper attention to climate change, and her messages around this seem to get through and penetrate to other people who would kind of align with that wing of politics in the US. And so maybe ways of kind of working with tribalism in a sense, in order to try and get people to be more open to at least kind of scientific argumentation, perhaps moral arguments as well. I'd be interested to hear if you know of any more examples of those kinds of interventions, or how optimistic you are that that could be a way forward here.
That's a really brilliant comment. Look, I think that you're right. The big question is credibility of people who give testimony, right? And so if you're branded as a liberal and you come out saying we need to do something about the climate, then conservatives are going to tend to dismiss what you say. But if you identify as a Tea Party activist, right, you already have some claim to credibility among people on the right. And then it might be possible that they would listen to you and they wouldn't listen to somebody who'd been sorted into the other kind of group. So trying to exploit that strategy, I think, would be very important. Now, you asked about whether examples where bringing people together in the right way has resulted in changing people's minds in a more inclusive direction. There's a pretty famous study of a civil rights episode in Durham, North Carolina during the 1980s, I think the late 80s. There was some sort of contest about further integration of the public schools, and a committee was formed which included a woman, a Black African-American activist, and a white male, I can only use the term accurately, redneck, racist, white supremacist. Okay? And what's interesting is that as these people had to work together on this committee on some very concrete sort of nitty-gritty bureaucratic matters, they began to establish trust and actually to listen to each other. And this white male and African-American female ended up actually becoming friends. And it looks like that the white male's views changed significantly in the direction of inclusion, became less racist, for example, less white supremacist. So yeah, I think, I mean, the first strategy you mentioned, getting somebody who's a Tea Party person to come out on the climate thing, that's an attempt at unbundling, right? I mentioned that the tribalistic mentality tends to bundle together issues into big unfissionable bundles, and it tends to lump together people. And the strategy that you described is to try to go against that, right? To find some, to not treat everybody on the right as the same, but to recognize there's some people on the right who do take climate change seriously, right? And that means also thinking that you can make some progress on the climate change issue without having to solve everything else. So it's both unbundling people and recognizing differences among people on the right, for example, that might make it easier to work with some of them, but it's also unbundling issues.
Okay, thanks, Becky. I've got a question here from Wells Emerson. Do you think it is possible to overcome tribalism in conditions of extreme economic disparity?
Probably not. I actually think that one of the neglected costs of extreme inequality is that it basically immobilizes empathy and makes it much harder to communicate with people that you disagree with. And I also think that people who are sort of entrepreneurs of tribalism, propagandists, people who see their own interest as tied to promulgating the tribalistic mentality, that they find it much easier to do their work under conditions of extreme inequality. And by the way, I think it's extreme inequality in the United States that has made democracy unworkable even before tribalism added its own destructive touch. Yeah, and I say this as somebody who's not an advocate of equality for its own sake. I'm not like Larry Temkin at all, but I just see the cost of some kinds of equality in large enough magnitudes. The cost in terms of our moral functioning is just prohibitively high. There's a wonderful example of this in Tocqueville's book on democracy in America. He quotes a letter from a woman in the Ancien regime, and she's writing to her daughter and saying, well, how are you? How are the kids? How's the new puppy? And then she just interrupts and says, well, we had a little revolution in our village. The peasants on our estate protested against our taxes. So we broke the leader on the wheel and hanged 13 of them. And that'll show people not to throw rocks into the gardens of good people. And then she goes on to talk about, the puppy, things like this. And Tocqueville says that this kind of callous disregard for the suffering of others, people who lived on her own estate, she sees every day, is only possible because of extreme inequality. Extreme inequality creates a psychic distance that disables many of the moral emotions that otherwise would support inclusive behavior.
Okay, thank you. Now we probably have time for one more question if there's anyone who wants to put their hand up, or I don't know if Julian, you want any last say, but at the same time we're basically done, so that might be enough if no one's got a burning question.
Well, I just want to sort of put you a bit on the spot, Alan, returning to a question that was asked before, just to sort of finish on a lively note. So to take sort of one example of tribalism is around gun ownership in the US. Yep. Now, I know you're a supporter of gun ownership in the US, and I know Jeff is somebody who's not. And when I hear both of you arguing, I don't hear a kind of tribalistic engagement, but I don't see any progress, or I don't see any way forward for progress on that issue, even though I respect both of the epistemic positions that you're coming from. So I'm just, somebody asked you before, what happens if we reach this point of, abandoning tribalism? We just find we have deep moral disagreements. Yep. Like we might have about gun ownership. Yep. How are we to become more inclusive in the face of this sort of deep pluralism about fundamental issues, gun ownership being one of them?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say I don't think gun ownership is really a fundamental issue. I think it's a symbolic issue, and I think the same is true with abortion. I don't really think that that many of the people who are so-called pro-life in the United States, that is against legalized abortion, really are committed to that view because of their reverence for fetuses, for fetal life. I think that abortion has just become a focus for a lot of other conflicts and uneasiness in society. I mean, look, there's been a huge change in the role of women, in the nature of the family, in acknowledgement of women's sexuality. And all of this is very frightening to some people. And I think that people look for sort of normative coordination points where like-minded people can converge on some issue. And I think that abortion is like that. And I think gun control is like that. I mean, look, most of the discourse of liberals who want more gun control is completely disengaged from any facts about whether the forms of gun control they're advocating would work or not. It's really just symbolic. They think that it's bad for people to have guns, it's dangerous, and that only people who are somehow stupid or defective wouldn't realize that. And it's more what gun ownership symbolizes than what the effects are, because they pay basically no attention to the effects. I mean, look, the number of guns in private hands in the United States has risen steadily, and yet homicide rates with the guns have fallen since 1975. And I'm not an advocate of, you know, assault rifles or anything like that. I'm just saying that I think that in a lot of cases, what looks like fundamental disagreements on matters of substance, it's not really that matter of substance. It's something else that's driving the divisions. And if somehow we could get to that, it would be. I mean, look, I think the Democratic Party ought to just shut up about gun control, because everything they've done hasn't worked, and it just alienates some swing voters that are single issue people. And frankly, I think they should shut up about abortion right now, because the number of abortions in the United States has been declining seriously. And by allowing the Republicans to make a huge issue of abortion, again, they just lose votes.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, Alan. And we're out of time there. So that just only leaves us to say thanks very much to Alan for an excellent talk and for fielding all our questions. And thanks to everyone for putting in your thoughtful questions. And that was book again.
Julian, thank you so much. Thank you for putting this on. I really enjoyed it. The comments and questions were terrific. And as you all know, I wasn't able to answer hardly any of them.
I just want to say, I think that actually Alan is spot on the mark, and I respect his work enormously for thinking that the ethics of believing, you know, is as important, if not more important, than the ethics of acting. And I think many of the mistakes that we make come from the way in which we form our beliefs. So I think in the future, Alan, you'll be seen as the pioneer of one of the most important areas of practical ethics. So, you know, I think that you're really attending to, you know, one of the biggest issues. So I'm pessimistic about our ability to go forwards, but I completely agree with you that this is where the money is. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.